Hey guys, it's Miss D, and this is your video review for World War II. Now, first things first, how does World War II begin? It begins when the Nazis invade Poland. Hitler invades Poland. That is the immediate cause of World War II. That's what sets everything off. But very similar to what we said about World War I, it is not just one event that leads to this massive war. There are many other underlying causes that led up to this moment. And the way you can remember those underlying causes is with the four-letter word HALT. Okay? And HALT stands for H, Hitler's actions, A, appeasement, L, the failure of the League of Nations, and T, the Treaty of Versailles. So let's start with H. H, of course, is a reference to Hitler's actions. Hitler was like almost uniquely aggressive, right? He had no shame in his game. He rose to a leadership position in Germany and got very, very popular because he said straight out, I am not going to follow the Treaty of Versailles. He had no problem violating it. He rearms the military, he builds up the army, he builds up an air force, and this was a complete violation of the treaty. They were supposed to be disarmed, but he ignored it. He put soldiers in the Rhineland. The Rhineland is this area between Germany and France that was supposed to be a military-free zone. He didn't care. He put soldiers there. He took Austria. Then he took the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia. And then he took all of Czechoslovakia. And lo and behold, his next stop, no one stopped him. No one stopped him. And then his next stop was to take Poland. That's what finally started the war. Next, the other cause of the war, the A in HALT, is appeasement. Appeasement is when you agree to someone's reasonable demand to avoid war. You're supposed to remember, this is coming out of World War I. Europe had been destroyed. It had been bombed to like smithereens. So many people had been killed. It was this terrible, terrible war. And so all of Europe really wanted to avoid, if at all possible, they all wanted to avoid another war. So when Hitler took all of these aggressive actions, they kept just letting it slide and just ignoring it and letting it go. Finally, you have the Munich conference. That's that photo in the bottom where you see Chamberlain shaking Hitler's hand. Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of England. And he agrees. He says, all right, we will give you the Sudetenland. We will give you this part of Czechoslovakia as long as you agree to have peace. And Hitler's like, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And instead of appeasement helping avoid war, it actually helps cause a war. It was a complete and utter failure. By practicing appeasement, it gave Hitler more time to build up his military, to gain a bigger foothold in Europe. This policy was a complete and utter failure. This idea that they were going to give in to Hitler's demands in order to avoid war, it failed. Instead, they could not avoid the war. Again, the L in HALT stands for League of Nations, and the League of Nations, of course, was a complete failure. You may remember from our previous exam, the United States, the country that actually came up with the idea for the League of Nations, never joined. So this was, from the jump, it was a very, very weak organization because it did not have all the nations of the world involved. In fact, if you remember from the cartoon in the top, Japan, when the League of Nations tried to stop Japanese aggression, when it tried to get Japan to leave Korea because it had annexed Korea, the League of Nations said, hey, you're being aggressive. We want to stop you. We want to avoid war. Japan just said, no, I'll quit. And Japan just walked out and just quit the League of Nations. So really, this was this was an organization that was set up after World War I. It was in that Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was created in order to create an organization that would help, to help the countries of the world, prevent another war. And the League of Nations was a complete failure. It did not prevent war at all. It was way too weak. Finally, the T in HALT stands for the Treaty of Versailles. And you remember, as the cartoon shows, really Hitler's party ended up really coming out of this Treaty of Versailles helped give birth to Hitler's party. It really helped make Hitler very, very popular because again, this was a treaty that was incredibly harsh to Germany, and it left the country bankrupt. It left the country really damaged. It created all this economic insecurity, and that opened the door to fascism. That the economic problems it caused, the desperation it caused, the humiliation it caused Germany, it created this environment where a leader like Hitler could really thrive because he said, I'm going to ignore this treaty, and it made, it won him a lot of fans in Germany. And the treaty was so harsh that, again, it really helped the European countries kind of talk themselves into kind of ignoring his violations. Like when he rebuilt his military, they were like, well, it was kind of unfair to ask him to do it in the first place, and da da da. So it wasn't enforced. So it was a really bad treaty. All right. So, as I said, once we begin World War II is between two different alliances. It was between the Axis versus the Allies. The Axis powers are made up of Japan, Italy, and Germany. The Allies were France, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Now, remember, at the start of the war, you have France and England. Later, Soviet Union changes sides, and finally the United States breaks with its policy of isolationism and joins America is the last to join the Allies. Okay, so yeah, the jig versus the FABS. I don't know if that helps, but nonetheless, there it is. All right, so let's take a look at some of the major events that happened during World War II. First thing that you have to remember, really big, important turning point in the war, is the fact that Hitler had signed a non aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Remember, that agreement was really important to Germany because if they did not have the USSR's agreement, Hitler would have been in fear of fighting a two-front war. So what happens is once he gets Stalin's agreement that he will not attack Germany, Hitler is free to focus on France, focus on the threat that is France, because he doesn't have to worry about his Eastern Front. Of course, Hitler ends up violating this treaty. He violates the agreement. He attacks the USSR anyway, and this is what leads the USSR to join the Allies, to join the war on the side of the Allies, which normally it wouldn't have done. Again, the USSR is a communist country. Nobody likes communists. Nobody likes communists. But, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Hitler's decision to violate this treaty is what drags the USSR into the war on the side of the Allies. And of course, fighting with the Soviet Union, that means that you've got to deal with the Russian winter. You've got to deal with the Russian winter. And again, just like Napoleon, the Russian winter is no joke. It makes resupplying your troops very, very difficult. This is an incredibly bitter, bitter cold. And this cold weather, just like it did a number on Napoleon, it did a number on Hitler. Okay? And it makes the Soviet Union very hard to conquer. The other major event in the war, obviously, is Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, that surprise attack on the U.S. naval base in Hawaii, is what gets the United States to say, hey, not my problem. Now it's my problem. The fact that Japan had attacked the United States directly meant that the United States could no longer stay neutral. We had to get involved. We could not stay out of the war any longer. Once we were attacked directly, it drags us into the war on the side of the Allies. Next major event you have to remember is D-Day. That was that video I showed you where the Allied troops land on the beaches of France. And this battle was really, really dangerous. These soldiers who were part of this battle are true heroes because this was a very scary, the odds were against them. The German were very much ensconced. They had really solid positions on these beaches. They were ready for an invasion, and yet this invading force, it was a really bad position to be in, and yet these guys made it up the beach and they were able to take this beach. And because the United States, this it was actually a multinational troop. It wasn't just U.S. soldiers, it was also British and the Canadians, and I think it might have been Australians too, but don't quote me on it. But this multinational force that took the beaches of France was absolutely critical to the Allies' victory. At the time of D-Day, the Nazis had almost all of Europe under control. But by taking this beach, it opens up a second front in the war. And now you have the Soviet Union continuing its fight in the East. Once you get into France, once you're able to take back France, now you open a Western front. And this is kind of the beginning of the end of Hitler and the Nazis. All right. The other thing you need to know is how the war ends. What happens is there is victory in Europe. First Italy is defeated, then Hitler is defeated, but the Japanese continue to fight. Even when the rest of the Axis powers had been defeated, Japan continues to fight. And so the US President Truman makes a decision that he will drop nuclear bombs on Japan. He decides he will drop nuclear weapons on Japan. It was the first and only use of nuclear weapons in wartime. And again, very controversial decision. I mean, anytime, again, just like you saw on D-Day, anytime you make a beach landing, it's a very bloody battle. In addition, you are going to be forced to attack somebody on their home front. If US, British soldiers had to, land in Japan on the Japanese homeland, you would have had men, women, children fighting. It would have been fighting in the streets. It really would have been a bloody, bloody battle. So, there certainly would have been a lot of loss of life, and the war could have dragged on for a really long time with more losses on both sides. However, when you drop a nuclear bomb, there is no way to limit that damage. You, by definition, are taking out men, women, and children. Okay? As you could see in the picture, that little girl in the middle of skipping rope was vaporized. Not just killed, vaporized. There's nothing left of her except for that shadow. You just instantly killed 70,000 people with the push of a button. With one bomb, you kill 70,000 people. This is crazy. And again, it wasn't just even one bomb. They didn't just bomb Hiroshima. They bombed Hiroshima. Japan didn't surrender. So 3 days later, they dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. You gave them 3 days and you drop a second bomb? The first bomb wasn't enough. You had to drop a second one? And again, same result. You literally vaporize people. You destroy entire cities. And not just instantly. Remember, people later are going to die from radiation. They're going to die from poison. You're going to, that this not really poison, but that radiation is going to cause them cancers and burns, and they're going to eventually die. So it has a lot of long-term effects. And again, this invention, this use of nuclear weapons, that's what starts the Cold War. That's why today we have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the Earth, I mean, like 2 times over. It really starts with this. So, this use of nuclear weapons, the development of a nuclear weapon, there's a lot of questions about it. Did it do more harm than good? It's a scary technology. It's scary what it's capable of. But nonetheless, it was used, and because of those 2 bombs, the bomb in Hiroshima and then 3 days later, a bomb dropped in Nagasaki, is what ends World War II. And after Japan is defeated, as you can see, the person standing there in the military uniform, that's General MacArthur, and the person across from him, that is Emperor Hirohito. So Japan was forced to surrender. The emperor actually had to get on radio and tell his people he was not a god. He had to, and they had to admit defeat. So once they admitted defeat, the country of Japan was forced to accept a democratic constitutional government. No more military dictatorship, no more of that. They had to accept a complete change of their government. They were forced to demilitarize. And today, Japan is actually a big one of our allies in Asia. All right, so that's basically World War II. The other thing you need to know about World War II is unfortunately there are numerous human rights violations that are associated with this war. One of them is the rape of Nanjing, the Nanjing massacre. Actually, this event actually happens prior to World War II. It's actually in that between the wars period. So it happens actually after World War One, before World War II. But this was part of this Japanese aggression. Okay, you have to bear in mind Japan after the Meiji Restoration, a big part of Japan's foreign policy was all directed at getting colonies that would allow them to get more raw materials for their factories. It's going to allow them to industrialize. It's going to create markets. So they start conquering lots of parts of Asia, including China. And when they came into China, the Japanese were absolutely brutal. This was in 6 weeks, they killed more than 200,000 Chinese people. Again, it's murder, rapes, torture, Chinese people, and others. So there's Korean women who are also used. Um, there's these contests of decapitating. So the Japanese were absolutely brutal. So this is one of the human rights violations associated with World War One and World War Two. In addition, the other major human rights violation that you have to know that's associated with World War II is, of course, the Holocaust. Remember, the Holocaust starts, you can kind of think of this kind of starting with these anti Semitic Nuremberg laws. Remember, Germany passed laws specifically against Jewish people. So if you were Jewish and living in Germany, you were subject to these really horrendous laws that prevented you from owning a business. It meant that you had to wear the Jewish star. It meant that Germans couldn't marry, Jewish people couldn't marry Aryan people. If you were a Jewish man, you couldn't hire an Aryan girl, as a maid or a servant. Really, these terrible laws. And again, they start taking property away from Jewish people and so on. And that's, it starts and it gets more and more harsh. Kristallnacht is the event that really sets off the Holocaust. That's that night of broken glass. And then after that, you get to the final solution where you have 6 million Jews who are murdered, as well as other groups. Remember, it was communists, it was the Romani people, you had homosexuals, you had, all different kinds of criminals and people from Eastern Europe, people were communists, so on and so forth. So again, this is another example of a genocide. So very similar to the Armenian genocide, this is an effort to get rid of a specific targeted group of people. And the goal is to wipe them out of existence. And again, the Holocaust killed 1/3 of the Jews of Europe. And as I said, it starts with the Nuremberg laws. At the end, you're going to hold the Nuremberg trials, which again, I showed you that video in class. And the trials were an attempt to hold these Nazi war criminals, find them guilty of war crimes for what the acts and the horrific events of the Holocaust, and hold them accountable for what they did because they were considered guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. All right, with that, I'm done. Good luck, and I will see you in class.